Good afternoon, gentlemen, and thank you so much for sparing the time to have this very important conversation. And I believe you are one of the key stakeholders in how India is shaping its renewable energy goals, aside from, of course, the larger infrastructure dialogue that we are having in India. First things first, what do you see as the next wave in India? Do you think it's the conversation around grid, storage, transmission, distributed RE, or something else? What is it that we need to focus on as the next wave? This is just an opening question because I want to understand what your thought process is. There are divergent views in the industry. There are various different focus areas. There are pros and cons to every subject that we'll discuss. But do we have a common voice on this platform is what I'm trying to explore to begin with. Chirdeep, starting with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we obviously invest across the energy spectrum. And I mean, to my mind, each of these have their role to play. I mean, I think in different forms and shape. And I would say that, I mean, everybody is aware. I mean, there's investments going on in all sectors, but it's happening with a lag. I don't think, you could say that anywhere less action is happening. But the important thing is how do these things come together? All these components come together to make the grid more efficient. I mean, for example, there's a lot of work going on in transmission. But as you build up more storage, the requirement for transmission also kind of, is rationalized. Again, things like, for example, you spoke about smart meters. I mean, that's another part of the business. I mean, globally, we see how its use is being done to rationalize tariff, make it more market determined. And again, I'll give you an example. The government's come out with a, guideline to have, time of day tariff for 20%. I mean, in the solar hours, bill 20% below. I mean, ideally, this is a top-down approach. Ideally, it should come, bottom-up. So, you get your data from smart meters or whatever your infrastructure you're putting in there. And then it comes down to the discoms again. Right? Are they motivated or innovative enough to be able to use that data and market determine that tariff? So I would say that all three components you spoke about, transmission, battery storage, etc., and also, have to work in cohesion to be able to have an efficient grid. And that will take care of the rest of the things.
Great, thank you. Mahendra, over to you.
Yeah, and completely echo the thoughts Chirdeep has mentioned. I think taking a step back, the good part for India has been that India's energy sector has sort of outperformed expectations over the last decade or so. And a lot of credit for that goes to all the market participants that have been involved. So definitely big credit goes to the policymakers who were able to create the right environment to attract sort of private capital into the space. But also equally credit needs to go to all the various private players who got involved in the space, were able to bring in efficiencies, were able to scale up capabilities to the extent now that India is becoming more and more self-reliant across the sort of supply chain across sectors. In that context, to say that going forward, what is required, I think more of the same is a key theme. And our policymakers are already working on it. So for some of the sectors that we are talking about, renewables has a significantly mature policy and regulatory framework. Some of the other segments, now we are seeing maturity coming in. Battery energy storage, maybe 18 months ago, you would have said that the commercial framework is not stabilized yet. But in the last 18 months, a lot has happened. Of course, it has been helped by the fact that the cost of batteries have also come down. But from a policy perspective, we now have a standardized commercial framework. We now have a clear division between the risks and responsibility of the developer vis-a-vis the user of the battery. And similarly in other segments like smart metering, etc. So I think more of the same from the policymakers. We need to make sure that we continuously adapt the regulatory framework to continue attracting private capital. We as fund managers who effectively channel some of the capital from offshore and domestic investors, it is also our role to make sure that we have the right sort of strategic offering for our investors, for them to be able to play an active role in this space. And that is incumbent on us and the people on this panel. And also for our private players and the individuals that are involved in the industry, I think we'll have to continuously adapt as things become more complex. So sum and substance is more of the same, basically.
Vivek?
No, thanks. And I think Chirdeep and Mahinder covered most of it. But see, I think when you look at India, historically, we have focused a lot on generation, right? That's where maximum private capital is coming. But going forward, I think we can't afford to just pick one sector and invest in that, right? We need to work through the value chain, from critical minerals to manufacturing to generation to delivery of that generation, right? So you need to work on the entire value chain. I think the thing that's getting more important going forward is energy security, right? And unless you're able to bring capital and attract capital for different forms of value chain, it's very difficult we'll always face a bottleneck. If not today, going forward, we'll face bottleneck probably in battery, for example. Some of the other issues that will come up, which will impact our overall value chain and overall generation profile, right? We need to get capital in each of those segments. We might not be infra investors only for the transmission or generation side. We need to attract capital for the manufacturing side as well, which is done quite well, at least for modules. But then on critical minerals, on battery storage, a lot of that capital has to come in. So I think policymakers have to be slightly ahead of the curve to think about what needs to happen over the next 5 years, next 10 years, rather than from a short-term perspective. But as Mahinder said, ultimately it's eventually tweaking what we have today to get the right outcome.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I think for actually sharing a very hopeful view, which I think is very encouraging, especially for us lawyers, when we are looking at policy, when we are looking at deal making. Frankly, this is great news. That brings me, actually, Vivek, thank you so much. You have just given me a cue for my next question to essentially say that what is it beyond the investment around, megawatts installed? So what do you factor in when you are the deal makers, when you are looking at your investment strategies from a climate change perspective, from an impact perspective? What else has started playing an important role in your decision making? I think it might be a very nascent conversation at this stage, but I think it's a very fundamental conversation, particularly when investor confidence is called into question, seeing what has happened on account of curtailment in Rajasthan and other states. When we look at, these 40 gigawatts being on the line, then your strategy can't be around just installation of megawatts. It has to be something more and beyond. So if we talk about impact, along with installation, along with what we are talking about as massive targets, some of them very well on track to be achieved, what is it, that one word that comes to your mind? And please explain it to me. What are those strategies that you factor into your climate change agenda when you're looking at profit making along with the impact that you want to make in the country? So Mahinder, if I can just pick your thoughts first.
Sure. I think, like you rightly said, for investors, there are only two key considerations, right? We need the ability to be able to deploy capital and have some visibility of being able to deploy capital. And second, we need to be able to assess the risk reward, and then we can take a decision whether it fits our requirement or our investors' requirement or not. In the first, visibility of deployment basically is derived from two fundamental factors. If you were to look at from a sort of capacity perspective, does India require capacity across generation, transmission, battery energy storage? The answer is yes, absolutely. We need significant capacity to be added, so there is no question around that. The other aspect to that is whether or not I am able to deploy capital depends on the policy, regulatory framework, the commercial framework. Today, is the framework conducive? It is. Will it remain conducive in the future? That is for the policymakers to ensure. Till now, I mean, it has worked well because the environment has been created in such a way that you've been able to attract capital, like I said. But having said that, I mean, I will take a step back to say that we are speaking now, of course, over a decade. Over a decade, it has been successful. But within that decade, and all of us have been active in that space, there would typically be a 6-month period, 12-month period where you would see no activity because some disruption would have happened. But the good part has been that over the longer term, we've been able to address any of those disruptions, adapt to it, and still succeed in our paths. Going forward would be no different. I don't think it is going to be a linear line where we'll continue expanding. There will be periods where you would see less activity. And then again, there'll be periods where there'll be increased activity. But I'm speaking now more on a longer term perspective that we are pretty hopeful and we are very optimistic. So, giving visibility on deployment. And On risk and reward, like I said, I think it goes back to what are you underwriting? So, if you have certainty around whether I'll get connectivity as a generation, entity, whether I will get the permissions that I need, if it's a transmission entity or a battery energy storage entity, what approvals do I need? How much time would it take for me to start construction? Because there are some things that I can control and there are some things that are beyond my control, where I'll require third-party help. So any visibility that can be given or certainty that can be given will attract more capital in. Now within that, of course, there'll be portions of investors who would say, I will only invest in operating capital, operating projects, and that's my capital. That's fine. But the more certainty you bring in, the greater amount of capital you're able to attract in this space. So I think for us as investors, these are the two questions that we always ask ourselves. And then every opportunity that comes through, you evaluate in the context of these two and figure out whether it makes sense for you or not. It may not make sense for me, it may make sense for Vivek, it may make sense for Chirdeep, but ultimately some capital will find a way as long as it makes sense.
Mahendra, you were in the middle of your thought. Anything where you would want to pick it up from, and then I can move on to others?
Yeah, no, I think, the point was we look at two things: the ability to deploy, ability to assess the risk and reward correctly, and then the investor chooses whether they want to invest or not. I think in many segments that has worked well so far. In some segments, we need to do a little more work to make it a little easier. The easier it is, the more capital will get attracted to that space. I think that's what I would like to say.
Thank you. Chirdeep, very quickly on to you. There are a few sectors which we can take certain inspiration from, particularly when Indian energy sector generally is staring at getting private players in distribution business. There are amendments to the Electricity Act that are being spoken of. Do you think telecom is a good example to see that it gives you the flexibility to actually bid for auctions, take care of the hard assets, take care of the distribution lines for that matter, modernize them or sell them, and sort of just uplift the infrastructure? Because one of the fundamental problems today that we have is actually the burden of the discoms. Whether that's the elephant in the room which needs to be addressed, and I think government has made many attempts to sort of handle that problem, take it by the horn, but unfortunately it's not been very effective. Any thoughts on that, whether patient capital, whether a different strategy would help in solving this issue, which I think is one of the largest policy issues staring at the electricity sector today in India?
Yeah, I think, end of the day, all boils down to distribution, right, in India. I think, look, it depends. I think as I think, probably Mahendra mentioned, the government is very conscious of this. So we see in the draft Electricity Act, them talking about reducing competition, removing cross subsidy. I think that if that is implemented, I think that will be a big win for the sector. Primarily because competition leads to cost reduction, innovation. I mean, it feeds on to the entire industry being more competitive, etc. So I think from our perspective, again, we'll have to see how that model is rolled out, because the infrastructure, etc. I mean, there are players, big cities that have been quite successful. And again, them increasing competition. So I think that's a sector that we've been eyeing to look at for some time. But we'll have to see how, in what form and shape does that come into. I don't have any particular ideas on how to further do that. But I think if what is stated in the Electricity Act, if that is in place, that's good enough, I think, to solving a lot of the problems of the sector.
Thank you, Chirdeep. Vivek, very quickly on to you. Actis has been one of the forerunners and one of the most success stories that we have had as far as fund investment in the electricity sector is concerned. I think we have been for you, opposite you, and we have seen how aggressive and how assertive you are, and how you are betting very high on the Indian renewable energy market. But one thing which is now raising a concern is the dip in demand for renewable energies. You keep reading these articles where the consumer behavior is what is now becoming a center point, which was earlier never talked about. So earlier we never spoke about the last mile consumer behavior to be as one of the variables in this equation of how you want to bet onto the renewable energy. Do you see there are any challenges that tomorrow the demand for renewable energy may dip, which may affect your long-standing investment goals in India or strategies in India? Or do you have some amount of flexibility in your strategy where you have factored this in and there would be a different path that you might want to take for that?
No, thanks for asking that, because that's a debate we also keep on having. Can we continue to grow at the pace that we've been growing historically? See, India needs energy. Any growing economy needs energy. So there will be a demand, I mean, if not for 20 years, at least for 10, 15 years, right? It's unfair to say that there's a lack of demand for renewables. What we need to say is there's lack of inflexible renewables. We need to have now dispatchable renewable as the next stage of transition that we're doing, right? So when actors invest, when we build platforms historically, we always built with a view that we want to build a company which can sustain beyond 4 or 5 years, which is our exit period, right? So now when you're looking at investments now, we are consciously focusing on quality of power rather than quantity of power. So megawatts versus delivered energy. It's also about what carbon you're displacing. If I make a standalone solar plant, it's only displacing in the afternoon time. It's not displacing actually coal plant. So that's the focus that we have, thinking of storage as an important part of the equation, right? And thinking of flexible power, dispatchable power, not just looking at discoms as the only outcome in terms of off-takers, but also look at corporate PPAs. And to think about, there's a policy framework, right? Government is also thinking the same way. With VPPAs coming in, with the carbon trading market coming in, government is also thinking the same way that discoms can't absorb everything. There needs to be a parallel market that operates for people like us who bring private capital. We can't just be tagging yourself to discom demand, right? So I think there's a lot of demand that will flow up if you start building solutions for discoms. I think, and that's happening now. You see tenders which are getting built specifically for a specific demand profile, and you see demand for that kind of tariff that those tenders are getting are definitely much cheaper than pure play thermal, right? So I would say there's demand being there, but you need to solve that demand and provide a solution for that demand.
Thank you, Vivek. Actually, one of the things that I've reflected a lot upon is that this is not really an era of energy transition, but likely energy adaptation. I think every energy source is going to find its place in this energy mix. It's very unfair to say if so because we are neutral participants, we sometimes end up in oil and gas conferences, and then we end up in renewable energy conferences. And from both the sides, what we hear is that, look, we are here to stay. So it's not really to say that one is versus the other, but it is to say that how one is going to supplement or complement the other. So Chirdeep, very quickly onto you. With this growth in the thermal power projects, many of the large players are now betting a lot on thermal power projects. There is a certain amount of reality check that has come on renewable energy. Yes, we want to make them a part of baseload energy consumption and how they actually become round the clock in true sense, and a dispatchable energy that as we speak of. And there is an alternate market which has a huge demand for it. What is your wish list? What do you think you would like to see, at least for the policymakers in the room, to change so that this reality of renewable energy really comes true and one finds them playing a far more majority role than what it currently is playing in practice as opposed to theory?
I mean, firstly, I think most of the people who are providing capital right now is for renewable energy. So there's no dearth of that. I think all of us, if you ask, I don't think any of us is probably doing thermal, at least at this stage. So capital is largely for that. Now, how do you attract more capital or make this transition a little bit smoother? One is obviously, you mentioned about the 40 gigawatt of outstanding LOAs and not converting PPAs. So, I mean, there is talk of, whether this in that sense, mixed signals. But I think going forward, what would be very helpful, and I think people can take risks on, construction, operating, etc. But this uncertainty is really killing, because then you're taking a bet on what will happen 3-4 years. If you're right side of the curve, you're okay. But if so your margin of safety kind of reduces. I would say, signing the PPAs as soon as one is aggregating demand from the states, and then coming out with the PPAs and let's say signing them as soon as possible, because that provides predictability to be able to deploy capital at scale. I mean, the second thing again is we often talk about preparation time. Like it takes almost 2 years from when a tender comes to when it's signed, and we asked to do a project in 18-24 months. That doesn't take into account transmission, whether it's there or not, and simple things. For example, if I commission my project in March or September, can change my returns materially. So how do you give a little bit more leeway to the sector, like instead of 2 months, 6 months? How do you make the grid, etc. So that will be helpful. The other thing I would say is maybe even in smart meters, for example, like LPS has worked very successfully in renewables. That's been one of the biggest driving factors in terms of a tick mark on the sanctity of the contract, right? After that was introduced. I think similar thing, but something like smart meters, where that will again, I think, kick out the sector. The other bit is when you talk about the Electricity Act again, when you talk about removing cross-subsidy and opening the corporate PPA market in a large way, which I think Vivek also spoke about, that is something which essentially reduces, then you're not talking about relying on banking, et cetera, and all, but make it a very clean, open market, which will, I think, really, I mean, right now, for example, I think 75% of it's still discom driven. And in global markets, it's mostly, a large part of it is corporate market driven. So I think some of these changes they implemented will give, flip to the sector to be able to rapidly deploy and make that transition earlier rather than, later.
Thank you, Jaideep, for that. Mahindra, your wish list.
I think they've, going again back to the fundamental aspects that any investor would look at. I think Chitdeep also touched upon it when he talked about the time it takes from the time you have identified and won a project to the time you actually deploy capital. Where he's coming from, I think where a lot of us are coming from, is the fact that there is a large volume of capital that wants to be invested in India, recognizing the fact that there's a large opportunity. It's a relatively attractive opportunity. It would be ideal if that capital was able to access the markets earlier. So the longer it takes from the time you've secured a capacity to actually being able to deploy capital, the greater the uncertainty, the greater the probability that some of that capital gets rooted away. You get alternate sources where you can get that invested. I think if anything that we need to do is we need to figure out a way that we can do this rapidly. The time it takes from LOA to PPA is a bit of a concern, but I'm pretty sure that it has been recognized by the policymakers. I hope that we are able to find a solution. But similarly in other segments, in transmission, the policymakers have done a great job. There's a lot of preparatory work that happens before a bid is awarded, which reduces effectively the time to develop and therefore the time it takes for you to actually start deploying capital. There are still surprises, there are still delays, there are still issues that come up, but at least it tries to address the obvious concerns that we may have. I mean, a similar approach in other segments would also help. The third thing that I would say is one of the key factors why renewables has been such a big success, frankly, has been the commercials of it. See, renewables today, after all the considerations, is still the cheapest source of power. And the adoption has been driven by that more than, the sustainability angle to it. I think anything that is able to bring down costs of, these segments which are more, cleaner energy in nature will automatically unlock the potential India has. So I think our effort should go around creating the right environment to be able to unlock that potential, because you don't really need to pull demand in this space. The demand exists. All you need to do is give them a solution that commercially makes sense for the users. And we've seen how the market reacts. On the CNI front, Vivek and Jaideep talked about it. The adoption has been so rapid because CNI consumers clearly realize every unit that I consume, I'm saving money. I think that's what we need to focus on.
Fantastic. Vivek, your last thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I think, policy consistency, right? And I think government has to find a way to merge the central policy with the state policies, right? I mean, we've been looking at CTU bids, CTU PPAs. I think that has to stop. India is a country which requires power left, right, center. They need to merge the two policies to bring consistency in what we do, so that I have a choice to pick the state where I want to go and deliver power over there. So that's something that, if that happens, I think you'll see investments flowing in most of the states, which has not happened.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yes, we have achieved a lot, and there's a lot more to do. That will certainly keep us busy for many, many years to come. And certainly, as a citizen, I feel very hopeful for this country. With this, I'll open it up for the audience. If there's any question for this panel, please. Yes, please.
Can we have a mic reach the front row, please?
Thank you, Rajat. Always resourceful. No, thanks a lot. Great panel discussion. And just wanted to touch upon when we say renewables in India, it's always been solar, wind. Thoughts on biofuels and solid biofuels and bioenergy in general. And there has been obviously a lot of push by the government, but it's probably not taken off at the same level as some of the other sectors. So love your thoughts. Question for the entire panel.
I'm happy to take a bit of that. I think for some of our investors, biofuels sort of falls in the gray area between fossil fuels and green energy. It's for that category of investors, the sort of the hurdle for anything to be considered clean is pretty high. So from that perspective, you have to be a little careful. I think the other aspect around biofuels has been one of the key reasons why renewables has been successful is that you don't have to rely on any external party for your supply of fuel. You're effectively just, banking on nature. But with a lot of, biofuel supply chains, there is this reliance that you have on third parties. And that is where sometimes things fall apart. So, and that's the same concern that you have with fossil fuel-based projects as well. If you're taking on that additional, obligation, you would want to have a commensurate return. We as investors have looked at a few opportunities in this space, and we have struggled to balance the rewards with the risks or uncertainties and unpredictabilities on the supply chain. And so I say, these are one of the reasons why, there is more capital going towards solar and wind rather than biofuels.
And also, from a legal perspective, if you today look at the way policies are drawn or the legislations are drafted, look at sustainable aviation fuel, look at CBG. These are looked at as if investment will come in from oil companies, right? These are something that is meant for that. So it's also perception driven because the technology sits on the fence, as very rightly Mahendra pointed out. So I think categorization from a legal lens also, very theoretically speaking, stands on a very different footing as opposed to what perhaps a wind or solar or a hybrid or with a battery attached to it would generally mean to clean investment. Anyone else? Okay. With that, thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And very sorry for the interruption, but we had our own small movie with an interval. So thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
look
Thank
forward
you.
to having
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
off the record good discussion with you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.